Hey, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make the best sourdough bagels. Okay, so let's get right into the nitty-gritty, and along the way I'll share with you a number of tips that can help along your sourdough journey. So the first thing I'm going to do is weigh everything in my stand mixer bowl. So the deal about weighing ingredients versus measuring them in volume or cups is that it is more precise and more repeatable. So when you put flour in a measuring cup, for example, say 1 cup of flour, it's not super precise because everyone might pack it a little bit differently. Your flour might be ground differently. So it's a little bit inaccurate. It will still work for sure, but weighing your ingredients definitely is more precise, and even more important and better than that, it's less cleanup. I'm always here for less cleanup. In the stand mixer, I am going to weigh out 390 grams of bread flour. So that was actually 395 grams, but here's the thing. It doesn't have to be that precise. 5 grams difference isn't really going to matter that much. Now, if you've been following Moon and Magnolia for the last few months, I've been using a lot of fresh milk flour. You can see my grain mills back here, and I've been transitioning my family to mostly 100% whole grain. But one of the things I really want to emphasize here is that you can make sourdough and homemade, scratch-made bread without fancy equipment. So I really want everyone to be able to come here and learn and feel like they can bake something even if they don't have a grain mill. Now, the other thing I want to note is I am using bread flour. You can definitely use all-purpose flour, but I'm using bread flour specifically because I want a little bit of a chewier texture. So bread flour has a higher protein content, which means it's a little bit chewier. We'll talk more about what that means in terms of kneading and the quality of the dough in a minute. But bread flour will definitely give you that more classic chewy bagel. But if you don't have bread flour, don't worry about it. Just use all-purpose. And now I'm going to throw in 20 grams of sugar. Don't forget to tare your scale. I almost forgot. And then 250 grams of water goes right into the bowl. And now I'm going to add in about 2.5 teaspoons of salt. The last time I made this, I think I used 2 teaspoons and I felt like they needed just a little bit more. So I'm going to try 2.5 this time and see how it goes. And this is pretty imprecise. I kind of just sprinkle it in there. I don't really measure my salt that closely, so I don't know if I'm the best role model for that. And of course, we need sourdough starter. So I'm gonna put 100 grams of starter in this stand mixer bowl, but here's the deal about this starter. This starter is completely inactive. I have not fed it in about 4, maybe even 5 days, and it's been in the fridge the whole time. You can use starter straight out of the fridge, totally inactive in any of your recipes. The only thing that will be different about that is it will take longer for your dough to ferment. So when you have an active bubbly starter, it is at its peak of yeast and bacteria for fermentation. When you have an inactive starter, it just doesn't have as much, so it takes longer. So when you make dough and you add sourdough starter to it, what you're really doing is just giving that starter a giant feeding. So it will still work. It will still get bubbly and active. It just will take a little bit longer, but I got nothing but time today, so that's no big deal. And now this is probably gonna get me down to like the bare bones of my starter. And actually that's okay. A really good thing you can do for your starter health is use most of it and just save a little bit and then give that a nice big feeding. That can help reduce some of the acidity. So in some ways, this is actually a pretty good thing to do because my starter could probably use a little bit of a fresh start. No pun intended. So in terms of ingredients, that is it. We just have starter, water, flour, sugar, and salt. And starter is actually just flour and water. So it's a really short list of ingredients. And you know, if you go to the grocery store and you buy a bag of bagels and you look at the ingredient list, it's like this long. But this is just really simple ingredients that are good for you and so delicious. So let's mix up this dough and we'll get these bagels going. Something I've been doing lately, it's been really helpful, is when I initially mix the dough in my stand mixer, I use the paddle attachment. That really efficiently combines those ingredients. And once they're combined, I switch to the dough hook. It's not totally necessary and it kind of feels like an extra step because I mean, technically it is an extra step, but I have found that it reduces how long the dough has to be in the stand mixer. So it's worth the 2 seconds it takes to swap out the attachments. Okay, so first I'm gonna get this going on low speed. I'm sorry, I'm just pulling my hair up so it doesn't get tangled in the mixer, which is not what we're going for here. So I'm just going to mix it on low speed with the paddle attachment to get the ingredients combined. Okay, so you can see that after 20, maybe 30 seconds with the pedal attachment, this dough has come together. And now I'm gonna switch to the dough hook. So the thing is though, this dough actually feels okay, but you may need to add more flour depending on the flour that you're using, the humidity of the day. There's a lot of factors that come into play here about how much flour you will or won't need. So I started with 390 grams of flour, and if needed, I'm going to increase that by a tablespoon at a time until it is the right consistency, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I kind of adjust as needed, but for the most accurate weight or measurements, be sure to get the recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. When I put those recipes on my blog, that is like my final version of it, the one that works the best. You might have to still make adjustments just depending on your flour or your needs, but that's always the one that is as close to precise as possible. Okay, so I had this mixing on medium speed for about a minute or two, and then I'll check the quality of the dough and we'll make adjustments as needed. Okay, this is way too sticky. So when we're making bagels, what we're looking for is a relatively stiff dough, but that is smooth and elastic. So 390 grams of bread flour was not quite enough. So I'm going to add in a couple tablespoons here and see how it goes. And this could be just the general measurements. It could be the type of flour that I'm using. It's been raining here for like, I don't know, it seems like 6 years now, but for at least a week it's been raining. So it's really wet and sticky. So there are a lot of reasons why this might be too sticky, but more importantly than why, we just gotta add more flour. Okay, so I added about 6 tablespoons of flour. So let's check out this dough. Okay, so this is looking really good. So let's talk about the quality of bagel dough because it's actually a little bit different than other types of dough. So I added 6 tablespoons of bread flour to this, which kind of seems like a lot. But most recipes have like a baseline for the flour and then you add to it as needed. So I needed 6 tablespoons of flour to achieve the consistency. But the consistency I'm going for is smooth and elastic, but also it's heavy. So when we are making something like a sandwich bread, what we're looking for is a really light and fluffy dough. Often it kind of feels like a cloud when you hold it. And what we're going for specifically is what's called the window pane test, which is where you stretch the dough and see if you can see light through it. And if you can, that means that the gluten has developed enough. We are not really going for high gluten development here. So when your gluten is developed in a dough, what that means is that it's strong enough to hold air pockets. And that's what gives bread that big, beautiful rise. We don't want our bagels to rise. We want our bagels to maybe rise a little bit. We do want them to have a little fluff to them, but bagels are dense and chewy. So what we're going for here is a heavy, dense dough that is smooth and elastic, but no need to pass the window pane test. So once your dough comes together and it's smooth and elastic, it can come out of the stand mixer, which makes it really easy. There's like no secret formula or magic trick to make sure it's kneaded enough. If it's together, smooth and elastic, you're good to go. Then all I'm gonna do is just spray this bowl with a little bit of avocado oil spray. And that just helps prevent the dough from drying out as it ferments. And then I'll just stick the dough right in here and set it aside. Okay, so now we just cover this with a damp towel, or you could use plastic wrap and set it aside until it is doubled and domed on top. Now, how long that takes kind of varies. So I use inactive starters, so that's gonna slow it down. So it'll take a little bit longer. It is a little chilly here today, but it's pretty warm in my house. So the warmer the temperature, the faster it will bulk ferment. So if you could stick your dough somewhere warm, it will go faster, maybe a proofing box, or if you have a warm spot by your oven or something like that, that will speed things up. But you can also just pop it in the fridge for up to 3 days and let it do a really slow cold ferment. That's what I like about sourdough. You can speed up the process, you can slow it down, you can make it fit your lifestyle. Whereas say with commercial yeast, you just gotta be ready when it's ready. Good morning, it is the next day. So I actually ended up cold proofing these overnight simply because it is so dark and rainy here lately that filming in the evening would not have worked out. But that's what's really cool about making sourdough, like I mentioned yesterday, is that you can make this work in your schedule. So once this finished bulk fermenting, I put it in the fridge overnight. And what's also really cool about that is cold proofing it will actually make it taste more sour. So if you want a more sour tasting bagel, that's a really great option. So you can see that this dough has doubled inside. So I actually took this out of the fridge this morning. It's been out for about 2 hours. So it's close to room temperature. And all we're going to do is turn this dough out onto a clean counter and shape it. So let me show you how to do that. So I'm just going to divide this in half and then divide each of these into half again, into quarters, and then one more time. So now we just have these little sections of dough that we just need to shape. To shape these, all I'm going to do is spin it on the counter and kind of drag it toward myself. The dry counter creates a little bit of friction, which can create tension in the dough, and that makes a nice little perfect ball of dough. Sorry if my light's changing. It's just really, really rainy and cloudy here. So I have like all my light kit set up and it's a little crazy in here. But what we're going to do now is shape this into a bagel shape. So just take your finger and poke a hole right through it. I find it a little easier to do this on the counter just to give me something to press against. So all we're doing is poking a hole in the bagel and then just pick the dough up and kind of shape it, into a ring shape. You want that hole to be about 1/3 of the size of the actual dough ball itself, and you have a bagel. All of the bagels are shaped, so now we just let them rest on the counter until they are puffy. How long that takes depends on how warm your space is. So for me, it's probably gonna take about 1 to 2 hours. I recommend covering them with a clean, dry towel. Also, just as a side note, I did not flour the counter here. I found with this dough, I just don't need to flour it. But also, you don't want a lot of that dry flour getting into the water bath later when we start to cook these bagels. So if possible, try to keep them on an unfloured counter. It has been about 2 hours and these bagels are puffy and ready to go into the water bath. I have 12 cups of water and 2 teaspoons of baking soda boiling on the stove, and I also have the oven preheated to 425 degrees, so we are ready to go. All I'm going to do to get these transferred to the water bath is pick them up using a bench scraper. So just kind of wedge it underneath and then gently transfer the bagel to a slotted spoon. You just don't want to drop it into the water and splash yourself, so a slotted spoon makes this really easy and safe. These are going to boil for 2 minutes on each side. So 2 minutes will create a little bit of a chewier, more classic New York style bagel. If you want a little less crust and a little softer, you can boil them all the way down to 30 seconds on each side. It's really up to you, but 2 minutes for me has been the perfect number. I am using a wider Dutch oven for this, which is helpful because I can fit 2, 3, even up to 4 bagels in here. So that is helpful if you have something a little bit wider, but not necessary. The other thing about using that slotted spoon that I think is important to mention is that if you try to just like drop the bagels into the water, they're gonna lose their shape because that dough is still really pliable. So using that slotted spoon holds the bagel shape too, which is pretty important for the aesthetic of your bagels. They are all out of the water bath, so now all we have to do is season them and put them in the oven. I'm gonna keep half plain and then use everything bagel seasoning for the other half of my bagels, but you could use Asiago, sesame seeds, cheddar jalapeno would be really good. So you can top them with whatever you want before baking them. And then these are going right into the oven for about 25 to 30 minutes at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. One thing to mention about the seasoning, so if you can see here, some of the seasoning, it's probably really hard to tell on film, but some of the seasoning isn't sticking great. The best way to do this is right when they get out of the water bath, put the seasoning on them while they're still wet. Filming sometimes slows me down a little bit, so I didn't quite get to it in time, but that will help the seasoning stick a little bit better. And after 25 minutes in the oven, these came out beautifully. They are so golden and chewy on the outside and soft on the inside. Now, I did adjust the recipe, so it now just calls on my website for 1 teaspoon of baking soda. 2 teaspoons of baking soda will give you a really dark golden crust, which I like, but I think more traditionally, it's not quite as golden, but it's really up to you if you want to use 1 teaspoon or 2 teaspoons. And you'll see in a minute here, I made a second batch for photos for my blog, and the ones with 1 teaspoon are a little bit lighter and more traditional looking. But you really can't go wrong either way. You can get the full recipe and tutorial for these delicious sourdough bagels over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. And if you want this recipe and all of my tutorials and videos right to your inbox, make sure to sign up for the email list. I will leave links for the recipe and the email list in the description box below. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.